Well, the defense has said the gunman would be willing to plead guilty in the federal hate crime case if prosecutors took the death penalty off the table.
During today's status conference hearing, the judge will likely ask prosecutors if they've made a decision on the death penalty. Trial attorney Brian Butler has tried more than 100 jury trials and is a former assistant U.S. attorney. He joins us now to analyze what we can expect in today's case. Brian, thank you for being here. This is just an awful story. Through and through. Meantime, though, the shooter already pleaded guilty to those state charges, as we mentioned. If he's convicted in federal court, who will ultimately decide whether he receives the death penalty?
So the first question that the Department of Justice is going to have to answer is, are they going to pursue the death penalty? It is an authorized punishment, obviously, for these heinous crimes, but there's a process for them to decide whether they want to try to seek that. If the Department of Justice chooses to seek the death penalty, then ultimately a jury would decide whether death was the appropriate punishment in the case.
Would the high-profile nature of this case be a factor at all?
I think the high-profile nature of the case is a factor. I also think the Department of Justice is going to look to the Dylan Roof situation in South Carolina, where that man horribly shot up a African-American church. I think 9 people died in that. The Department of Justice sought the death penalty and obtained a death penalty in that case in 2017. Roof remains on death row. I think that probably argues pretty heavily that the Justice Department will seek the death penalty against this man.
And if he does plead guilty, what reasons might prosecutors decide to accept or reject that plea?
So anytime that the death penalty is an authorized punishment, if the death penalty is given by a jury, you really do have to weigh that. It's like the victim said, I don't want to see you die. I want to see you live for the rest of your life and think about what you did. You may have some victims' families that don't want the death penalty. You may have other victims' families that do want the death penalty. The appeal process from a death penalty verdict is substantial, so these victims will continue to live with the judicial process along with, of course, the wish of losing a loved one for the rest of their lives. But the judicial process is long, it's painful. They're going to have to go through a trial. In the trial, you're going to relive all this horrible tragedy in painful detail. So there are reasons why the government could say, we think life without any chance of being released is the appropriate punishment. But ultimately, I think the government is going to come back and say, this is such a heinous crime. You have 10 people that tragically lost their lives. And I think they'll look to the Roof case and the McVeigh case and say that this is a particularly gruesome, horrible, hateful crime, and it deserves to have the community decide whether death is the appropriate punishment.
So if this case goes to trial, how long could it last, and who ultimately decides if the shooter is going to be sentenced to death?
It could last several weeks. I suspect, obviously there's no defense. I mean, he's pled guilty. There's not going to be, I didn't do it. It's going to be all about, I'm remorseful. You heard some of his statement yesterday. I got caught up in this online hate, and I'm sorry. And he's really going to try to sell that to see if he can save his life. And I think you're probably looking at several weeks of trial. Ultimately, the jury will make the decision whether death is the appropriate punishment or not. I mean, theoretically, a judge could reduce a death sentence if a jury gave it, but that would never happen. Judges follow juries' recommendations.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see, that apology from the shooter here. I'm not sure that's really registering well with the families affected. I'm maybe falling on deaf ears there.
Having sat with many families that have lost loved ones, apologies like that ring pretty hollow.
Yeah. Attorney Brian Butler, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.